For years, there was a quiet promise whispered across America. If the coasts flood, if the wildfires close in, if the hurricanes get too strong, there are still safe places left to run to. Cities tucked away from the ocean, mountain towns far from the flames, quiet inland communities where climate change was supposed to stay someone else's problem. That promise just broke, and almost nobody has fully processed what it means that there may not be a safe place left at all. Let's start with the place that broke that illusion hardest: Asheville, North Carolina. For years, Asheville was held up as one of the best kept secrets in America for people trying to escape climate disaster. It sat far from the coast, tucked into the mountains, away from hurricane landfall zones and wildfire corridors out west. Real estate brokers in the area openly marketed it that way, telling clients this was a safe haven from the wildfires scorching the west and the hurricanes battering the coastline. People believed it. Families sold homes in Florida and California and moved their entire lives to the mountains of North Carolina specifically to get away from exactly what eventually found them anyway. Then Hurricane Helene arrived. Water in the French Broad River crested at over 27 feet, tearing through Asheville and surrounding towns with a force nobody there had planned for. More than 230 people were killed. Homes and highways were erased like chalk wiped off a blackboard. Thousands of residents were left without power or clean drinking water in a place that was supposed to be immune to this kind of catastrophe. North Carolina's assistant state climatologist put it about as bluntly as a scientist can. Any place that can get rain is not a climate haven because rain events themselves are only getting more extreme. And here's the part that should really unsettle you. Nearly 2 years later, officials are still struggling to rebuild not just the buildings, but the confidence that the region can handle the next one. Local business owners have worked hard to bring tourism back and get the economy moving again, but regional planners have been noticeably slower to invest in the kind of long-term infrastructure that would actually prevent the next disaster from being just as devastating. The recovery focused on getting things looking normal again, not necessarily on making sure normal could survive what's coming next. Asheville isn't an isolated story. It's part of a much bigger pattern researchers have been tracking for years, and it has a name: climate havens. These are the cities and regions that researchers, city planners, and real estate developers pointed to as natural refuges from extreme weather, places people could move to and finally feel secure. Analysts and investors specifically promoted states like Wisconsin and North Carolina this way. But recent storms and flooding have exposed just how shaky that promise really was. The concept fueled real estate speculation, with developers and insurers marketing entire regions as safe zones, even when the underlying climate data told a very different story. Take the Great Lakes region, often cited as the gold standard climate haven because of its access to roughly 20% of the entire planet's fresh water, its distance from rising seas, and its historically low risk of extreme weather compared to the rest of the country. Cities like Ann Arbor picked up the climate haven label almost like a badge of honor. But researchers who study this closely say that label can be dangerously misleading. The stormwater systems protecting many of these so-called haven cities were designed using precipitation data that doesn't even account for climate change in the first place. And an updated version of those safety standards isn't expected until 2026 at the earliest. One detailed analysis found that 5 out of 6 major haven cities studied actually face moderate or major flood risk right now, not risk contained safely in some distant future. Those same counties have already been hit by an average of 6 federal disaster declarations, 2,000, roughly 1 major disaster every 4 years, and that frequency is climbing. Across the country as a whole, the picture is even starker. The average number of federal weather-related disaster declarations has nearly doubled compared to the 20 years before that. So the very data meant to prove these places are safe is quietly showing the opposite. The disasters are already arriving. They're just arriving slower and less dramatically than what people are fleeing from, which makes the danger easy to underestimate until it's too late. An emergency management professor summed up the flaw in the entire climate haven idea in one simple sentence: just because a specific disaster is less likely in a particular community doesn't mean it will never happen there. Likelihood isn't the same thing as safety, and that distinction is exactly what got lost in the marketing. A director at a major urban planning research center went even further, calling the whole idea of a climate refuge something close to an escapist fantasy, arguing that to the extent any real refuge exists at all, it isn't really a physical or geological phenomenon. It's a social and economic one, shaped far more by who can location's actual immunity to disaster. That distinction matters enormously because it changes who actually benefits from the climate haven narrative. The idea that certain places are safe from climate change has already reshaped investment patterns, infrastructure spending, and migration decisions across entire regions, often benefiting wealthier people who have the resources to relocate toward these supposedly protected zones while leaving lower income and more vulnerable populations behind in the places being left. Behind or crowded into the very same haven cities without the means to weather what eventually catches up with them there too. And it's not just hurricanes finding their way into places that thought they were protected. The Northeast, long considered relatively insulated compared to the hurricane-heavy Gulf Coast, is now seeing roughly 50% more extreme precipitation events than it did before 1995, according to research out of Dartmouth College, a finding backed up by the federal government's own national climate assessment. Vermont, another state once quietly whispered about as a potential climate haven, has been hit by catastrophic flooding in consecutive years, turning towns like Burlington from a refuge into another, example of exactly the kind of disaster people thought they were escaping by moving there. Here's the deeper problem underneath all of this, and it's the part that should really change how you think about the future. We live in one interconnected climate system. Scientists studying this have been clear that no place on Earth remains truly untouched by a warming planet, because the atmosphere doesn't respect state lines, real estate listings, or reassuring nicknames like haven or refuge. If colossal hurricanes, torrential floods, sprawling wildfires, and relentless heat waves haven't already made that message clear enough, it's hard to imagine what will. So if the safe places are disappearing, and the data increasingly suggests they never really existed in the way we imagined, what does that actually mean for millions of people currently making life-altering decisions based on where they think disaster won't reach them? It means the entire framework needs to change. Instead of chasing a location that promises immunity, which the evidence increasingly says doesn't exist, the smarter strategy becomes understanding the specific risks of wherever you already are, and demanding the infrastructure investment that actually protects against those risks, rather than relying on a comforting label that was often built more on marketing than on meteorology. It also means we need to rethink how relief and recovery get distributed, because when everyone believes certain regions are havens, resources, planning attention, and infrastructure spending naturally drift away from those areas right up until the moment disaster proves the label wrong, and by then it's the residents left holding the damage, not the planners and developers who sold them the fantasy in the first place. The uncomfortable truth is this: there may not be a next safe place waiting somewhere on the map. There may only be places that already have. Asheville hadn't been tested, now it has. Vermont hadn't really been tested. Now it has, more than once. The Great Lakes region, still wearing its climate haven label proudly, simply hasn't been tested at the scale researchers warn is coming. That's not the same thing as safety. That's just a countdown nobody's watching closely enough yet. There's also a financial dimension to this that rarely gets discussed outside of insurance. Industry reports, and it might end up being the fastest way regular people find out a haven never really existed. Insurance companies build their entire pricing models around risk data, and when disasters start showing up in places that were previously rated as low risk, premiums in those areas don't stay low for long. Homeowners in newly popular haven cities are already reporting insurance costs rising even before a major disaster hits their specific community, simply because insurers are recalculating risk across entire regions based on what's happening nearby. In some cases, insurers are pulling back from writing new policies altogether in areas experiencing rapid climate migration, precisely because the influx of new residents and new construction is happening faster than anyone can accurately reassess the underlying risk. That means people who move to a haven city seeking stability can end up facing skyrocketing costs anyway, driven not by a disaster that's already struck, but by the market quietly pricing in a disaster everyone suspects is coming. Then there's the infrastructure problem, which is arguably even harder to fix than insurance pricing. Cities that never expected rapid population growth built their water systems, roads, and power grids for a much smaller number of residents. When climate migration accelerates and thousands of new residents show up in a handful of years, that legacy infrastructure gets pushed well past what it was ever designed to handle long before a hurricane or flood even enters the picture. A stormwater system built decades. Ago, for a sleepy town of 30,000 people, doesn't magically scale up just because the population doubled. It strains, and eventually it fails, often during exactly the kind of extreme rainfall event that climate change is making more common everywhere, haven or not. So in a strange twist, the very popularity of a climate haven can actually make it more vulnerable, not less, because rapid growth outpaces the infrastructure. Upgrades that would be needed to handle both the new residents and the new climate reality at the same time. There's also a psychological cost to this shifting picture that deserves more attention than it usually gets. People who relocate specifically to escape climate disaster often carry real trauma from whatever they left behind: a flooded home, a burned neighborhood, a hurricane evacuation that went sideways. When the place they move to for safety turns out to be vulnerable too, that discovery doesn't just create financial and logistical headaches. It can be genuinely destabilizing on a personal level, forcing people to confront the idea that there may not be a version of moving away that guarantees the safety they were promised. Community planners and mental health researchers studying climate migration have started flagging this exact pattern. Families who did everything right, researched the risks, picked the safest option available, and still ended up facing a disaster they thought they'd left behind for good. So where does that actually leave someone trying to make a real decision about where to live in a world where the map of safety keeps redrawing itself? The honest answer researchers keep circling back to is that resilience matters more than location. A community with strong building codes, updated stormwater infrastructure, robust emergency communication systems, and local leadership willing to invest before disaster strikes rather than only after will consistently outperform a community that simply has a lower statistical chance of getting hit, especially as those statistical odds keep shifting under everyone's feet. In other words, the smarter question isn't which city is safest today. It's which city is actually preparing for tomorrow, because the ones resting on their haven reputation are precisely the ones most likely to get caught off guard. If this made you rethink what safety actually means in a warming world, do us a favor and like this video and subscribe, because we're going to keep uncovering the places, the myths, and the warnings that aren't making the headlines yet, but absolutely should be. The world isn't just losing its safe places. It may never have really had them to begin with.